Yes, now at that time, I was talking to my platoon commander and he'd ordered me down to the casualty clearance station, and I had a little bit of an argument with him. I said, it's no place to go, they were dead and down there by the score. And I looked at him and his injuries were much the same as me because he had been hit as well. I said, I'll tell you what, sir, when you go down there, I'll go with you. And he sort of looked at me and he said, right, corporal, he says, go and rest, he says, and come and see me when you feel better. I guess I was in a state of shock. So I found a nice corner in a barn somewhere with a nice dry straw, and I think I must have slept for about 24 hours. But when I wakened up, I felt much better, and I went to report to the platoon commander, and he had a good look at me. By this time I'd had my wounds cleaned up, and I felt a lot better. And although I couldn't see very well out my left eye, I said, I don't want to be evacuated. I said, I want to stay. Now, I wasn't being a hero, I just felt it was my duty. So he allowed me to stay, and right, the platoon commander sent me off to find a rest area, and I found a place in a barn with nice clean straw, and after about 24 hours sleep I felt much better. I reported back to him and he said, well done, corporal. He said, are you fit? I said, fit enough, sir. He said, you capable of taking over a gun of your own? And I said, I am, sir. So he then formed a new gun team for me. I knew them all, so I didn't have any difficulty settling down with them because we'd done all the training together. But at this point I'd like to recap a wee bit. During our briefing prior to the action, although they told us what our objective was and what we had in support and a sort of broad picture of what the battle was going to be, one of the things I forgot is who we were going to fight. And it turned out it was Hitler's crack troops were up against. In other words, it was the Hitler Youth. These were fanatics. The youngest one would be about 17 years of age, much the same age as myself. And believe ye me, they were fanatical. They waited until you were about 10 yards from them before they stopped firing, and then they put their hands up and expected you to take them prisoner. But again, as I say once more, just one of these things. But towards the end of that first action, we were told that there were the elements of 6 different divisions in front of us. And it was then that various people came to congratulate us, like the divisional commander, the army commander came out as well, I believe, and the corps commander, General O'Connor, and told us how well we'd done. And of the 3 divisions, we'd suffered 4,500 casualties in that week, and 2,500 had been suffered by 15 Scottish divisions. So we'd seen more or less more of our share of the battle. And the battalion itself, with over 200 casualties, and particularly among the officers and NCOs, it was a tremendous loss. So we're out of action for about a fortnight, getting re-equipped, and then we started getting reinforcements sent to us. Now, when I joined the battalion, I was surprised at the number of English people that was in the battalion, especially around the Lancashire area and Yorkshire area, and quite a lot of Londoners. But the reinforcement that came to us, the first draft was from the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. I believe there was 80 of them. So we faced up calling ourselves the Ox and Jocks, for the want of a better name. But we soon settled them down and fitted them into regiments and got them both morals, and they were quite happy to be called the Ox and Jocks. And to be honest with you, they turned out to be absolutely excellent troops. Now, after about a fortnight out of the line, we'd heard that things were pretty static, and we were going to have another go at them. This time we were going to attack to the right of Hill 112. So we'd back up the same road, up through Gabru, up to Barong, which is the next village up. There we deployed. The Gordons in front, they were to make the initial attack, followed by the Highland Light Infantry and ourselves. Now that night, although we were half a mile behind the front line, we know the Gordons put in 4 attacks that night, and 4 times they were driven back. Then we started getting mortared and shelled, and it was pretty grim, I don't mind telling you, as bad as Gavru. And during the course of the night, we had over 100 casualties in the battalion. As I say again, half a mile behind the lines. Now, one of the casualties that we suffered there was our own Brigadier Macintosh Walker, a fine officer. who'd been with us from the time that the brigade had formed up, and he was killed at his command post at Barong. And I'll say again, it was a big loss. The next thing we heard was that Brigadier Colville, or Colonel Colville of the Gordon Highlanders, was taken over as Brigadier. Then we're told that because of the situation, we're pulling us back out again, that attack had failed. Now, we didn't like it at all. We didn't like being losers. And it was the only time ever that we had to be pulled out. But again, we suffered so many casualties that it was just a pointless going any further. So we pulled out, and about a week later we were told to stand by for another move. And they then moved us up into the American sector. And we took over from, I believe it was the 11th Battalion of the 111th American Regiment. Now these chaps had landed in D-Day, and they'd been in the same position from D-Day, and this was now coming up to the beginning of August. So when they pulled out, they left us all in dugouts, which was very, very comfortable, having been there for 6 weeks. A tremendous supply of cigarettes and chocolates and American rations, which made a change from our compo which we've been living on, and our hard army biscuits. So again, we got a tremendous briefing for this, and we're told that the tank support this time would be old friends of ours who had done a tremendous amount of training with in Yorkshire, the 6th Independent Guards Brigade. Now you can imagine guardsmen, 5 of them all squeezed into a Churchill tank. They must have been pretty cramped. There was the Scots Guards, Coldstream Guards and Grenadier Guards. I can't remember the battalions actually involved, but they were tremendous tank crews, I don't mind telling you. And we're very, very happy to have them with us. So when we did start off again with a tremendous barrage of artillery, and this time we had some tremendous close support from the Royal Air Force, bombers and fighter bombers. And it was nice to see these Typhoons and Spitfires circling above us. It gave us a tremendous amount of confidence because we knew quite well there wouldn't be a German vehicle moved as long as they were up there. Now that day, we myself as infantry, marched for 14 miles cross country. We fought our way through 3 very strong German strong points. We'd taken quite a number of prisoners. And then that night the tanks radioed back to say they were 30 miles inside German lines and there wasn't a German to be seen. Unfortunately, that morning, and it was unfortunate, a rather sad story, one of the chaps had joined up with me, a little fella called George Martin. When he heard that I was a regular soldier, he had changed his engagement from duration of emergency, as they called it these days, or the duration of war, to become a regular soldier. And he came up to the Orkneys with me and went down to, did all our training together. He went to D Company, I stayed with Support Company. Now that morning, D Company passed through us to start their attack. And I saw the company disappearing through this hedge into a field, and the next minute there was an explosion, and stretcher bearers went rushing through there and brought George Martin back. Now George, I recognised him as stretcher, but only just. He had lost his right leg, his right arm. I didn't think he would save it, all up his right side and his right face, as well as his right eye. And I was ever so sorry because, as I say again, he was a very, very close friend of mine. At the same time, they brought out the company sergeant major. He had lost a foot on a shoe mine. So we knew then that we were really running into a real defended position. However, there were quite a few casualties that day from mines, but on the whole, very little other casualties from rifle and machine gun fire, and mortar fire and artillery fire was minimum. However, that night when we stopped at our defended position, the Scots Guards, who had sort of ring of tanks round us, were just settling down when the next thing we heard a battle in front of us just over the crest of a hill. And it turned out it was 2 German, one a tank and one mobile artillery, had opened fire in these Churchill tanks and knocked out 10 tanks. Fortunately, the crews were out the tanks and there was only manned by 1 person a turret, so their casualties were quite light, but they did lose 10 tanks. By the time were sent up there with 6-pounders, we were told, these tanks had disappeared, they'd gone. So rather sad ending to the day. First of all, losing George Martin in the morning, and then seeing these 10 tanks in fire at night time, which was, what's the word for it? Really sad. However, the next day went on and on and on, and we finished up at a place called the Vassy Road. Again, we're under intense machine gun and artillery fire from tanks. Although we didn't see the tanks ourselves, looking hard enough for them, we heard there was quite an action off to our left where our 25-pounders were firing over open sights at 4 German tanks that appeared. So we fought our way up this road, and at the end of the day, again, as always happens, late in the afternoon, a company commander called Alan Fife put in an attack on just a little copse. I said, well, clear that one, he says, and then it'll secure the line. And as they moved across the open ground towards this cop, the Germans opened fire on them, and I believe they suffered, it was either 26 or 28 killed or wounded. So they lay out there in the open until a Major Morton, who was our company commander at one time, he now had a rifle company, went out with a flag, and although he was fired at, he made contact with the Germans, and we called an armistice, and we sent out our stretcher bearers and various people to bring our casualties in, including Major Fife, who had been killed. So, as I say once again, it always seems to happen late in the day, somebody gets killed that you know extremely well. So we held on there for about 2 days, and although we had little incidents like a German armoured car or a half-track come driving through our lines in the morning full of tea and coffee, they had no idea where their own troops were. So we captured that. Coffee was awful. It was even worse than our tea. However, we'd taken 3 prisoners there, and again, stragglers started to come in. All sorts of nationalities, particularly Russians. So the line was static more or less, and we're told then that the Americans had put in their big attack around St. Lo, down, I think it was Sargent they called it, and they were wheeling left to come round behind the Germans heading towards Paris and to cut the Germans off at Falaise Gap. Now that virtually ended our sort of attack there, although again we lost a tremendous number of good people in there. We had about, I think there were about 30 killed in the 3 days fighting and about 100 wounded. So again we were pulled back into a rest area. Unfortunately the rest area we were in that night got bombed. I think it was 3 German bombers come over, and we lost 7. There were water platoon killed, who were all close friends of mine. And again, we lost Captain Sloan, who was a mortar officer. He was killed as well. Major Kenneth, who was standing in for the commanding officer, who had to go back for a small operation. He was very badly wounded. I believe he lost his right leg and fingers of his right hand. So all in all, it was a most unsatisfactory end to that particular action. So we then left in limbo for about 4 days, and although we're told we're going to take part in attack at Falaise, it didn't came to anything. I think we're in too poor a state, we'd suffered too many casualties to have any use to anybody. So again, it's a case of just waiting there to be reinforced and re-equipped. However, a very funny incident happened. There was a major arrived on Mids called Major Ferguson, and it turned out that he had escaped, as they call it, from the hold and drafting unit, and he'd been marked absent without leave. He'd been posted to another unit, but when they heard that Giles had so many casualties, he thought it was his duty to report to Giles. So before we knew where he was here and he'd gone, and then we heard the story that he'd been ordered back and he was in serious trouble apparently, but it all turned out in the end, because I met him after the war. It turned out he was a brother of the great Sir Bernard Ferguson, who was a Chindit leader. So that was another story. But prior to that, I would like to mention this one. We did see the 1,000 bomber raid on Caen and KPK airfield, and this is after our first action. And we actually saw a 1,000 bomber raid going in. They were only about, I doubt very much, if 1,000 foot up. Streams of bombers coming in, controlled by a little aircraft called an Oster. And this chap was just more or less circled round there in a very tight circle, directed these streams of bombers in on different targets. So it was, wonderful sight to see. We were more or less level with the height of the aircraft where they were bombing from. We were on a bit of a high ground. Unfortunately, when the Canadians moved forward to capture the airfield, the Germans had been underground, and up they came, and we could actually see these Canadians being slaughtered. Dozens of them were getting shot down, although they'd be about a mile away. You could still see them through binoculars. So that was the sort of end of the Battle of Normandy as far as we were concerned. But I thought I'd throw that one in, although it happened about first week in July, I believe, when the Canadians took KPK finally. It was quite a battle for that airfield. So that more or less finished our Battle of Normandy until we come up to Falaise. Now we're told then that there was a big rush on to get up to the Seine. However, when we reached Falaise itself, it was the most horrendous experience of the war so far, with quite a number of them. We had 7 miles of road, and on both sides of that road there were a mixture of horses and men. The smell was dreadful. And they called this a great victory for the Royal Air Force. Well, it showed us just what air power could do. There was guns, there was vehicles of all description, but it was then that we learned that most of the German army, well, I reckon at that time, about 80% of it moved with horse transport. We couldn't believe it until we saw the number of dead horses in that field, on these fields. There was 7 miles of it, and it took us all day moving up behind bulldozers. They were trying to clear the road in front of us to get us through, and believe you me, when we get through that Falaise gap, we were relieved people. The smell lives with me even now. You could smell it, and they tell me that the road further to the south was even worse. It was indescribable, the scenes that we saw there. Anyway, having got through that, we then, big purge. The roads were clear, they were pretty straight right up to the Seine. And I believe we made the Seine in one day. And having got up to it, I think it was mid-morning, there was a very, very quick old group, and they decided there'd be no preparation, that they would bounce the Seine that day. Well, the girls again, we were tail-end Charlie sort of style, so we were told to load our vehicles with canvas boats, assault boats, and we were what we call bearer party, if you like, for want of a better word. And we moved the boats up and handed them over to the Highland Light Infantry on the right, bigger pardon, the Gordons on the right, and the Highland Light Infantry on the left, helped them to get the boats into the water for them to do the assault. Unfortunately, the Gordons, they ran into machine gun fire and they lost 2 of their boats, and they had quite a number of casualties. So they pulled them back very, very quickly under fire and under a smoke screen. And we concentrated on the Highland Infantry side. So they had a very successful landing. And having followed them up, we then deployed on the other side. We took a place called St. Angeles, which was a big chateau. Unfortunately, again, we ran into pockets of Germans, and I lost a Lance Corporal at that time. From a German, I think this Lance Corporal had waken him up. He was lying about in a slip trench and shot this Lance Corporal. So we finished up throwing grenades into this hole and killed him. So we're always very wary of what we were doing, with these odd people that was around. There were still these fanatics that didn't know the war was virtually finished. We then took a town called Louviers, and what a welcome we got there. It's the first time we'd actually seen any French people, apart from that family that I'd liberated at Tourville. This is the first time we've actually seen a French village with any population in it at all, and the welcome they gave us was wonderful. The wine appeared, and the brandy appeared, and the fruit appeared, and they gave us everything that they virtually had, although they were starving themselves. And they told us that the Germans just pulled out about an hour before. So having occupied the town, we then sorted it out and got myself moving again, filled up with petrol and checked for ammunition. And this time they had bridges built across the river, and there were streams of armoured vehicles pouring across, tanks of all sorts of description. And this is the time when I saw I believe it was either Covenant or the Cromwell, which was a new cruiser tank with a 17-pounder gun mounted on it. Although we had were N10s, which was supports an adult turreted vehicle with a 17-pounder mounted on it, which could take on these German 88s. So all in all, the war was moving extremely well. So after sort of doing wood clearing around the place and getting myself established, we then moved across the north of France, and it was just one great big race. We were doing 110 to 120 mile a day to a little town called St. Paul, S-T-P-O-L. When we occupied that, this was a railroad junction, just south of Calais, I believe. So again, it gave us time to get ourselves sorted out, got ourselves vehicles filled up with petrol, checked all our tracks, and off we went, racing up into Belgium. So although we got a tremendous reception from the French people, when we got into Belgium it was even better. The roads were straight, everybody was out the roadside, there wasn't a German in sight, there was no firing. And we moved right up through various villages till we came to a place called Moll, M-O-L-L. And there we stopped. The recce went out, the recce regiment, and they come back and said, you know, that the bridges were still up over the Escott-Gille Canal. It's called the Junction Canal, which we were to take. So having done recces, we were then told to take the canal. So the 44 Brigade went over first, Royal Scots and Royal Scots Fusiliers, and they quite a battle to take a little town called Donk, D-O-N-K. They held on there for about 10 days, and we were on this bank on this side, and we could hear and see everything that was going on until it was our turn to cross. Now, it was us and the Gordons went over much the same time, and the road was straight up through this village, and at the other end of the road was either a German tank or a fighting vehicle of some description, firing an 88 down the road. And from the time he fired to the time the shell exploded, you had 2 seconds to find cover. Well, all the way up that road there was all sorts of bodies, British and German. And as we moved up the left-hand side of the road, so the Royal Scots Fusiliers was moving down the left. So eventually we got into the positions we're going to be, and I found myself to the right of the church, manning a 6-pounder which had been left by the Royal Scots Fusiliers. So we checked around to see what was in front of us, and there were just enough sort of daylight to have a look. Got myself into position. I'd settled down for the night, sorted out who was going to do the first watches, and that was us stuck in there for 10 days. Now, every day was packed with incidents. We got attacked in the morning, we got attacked at lunchtime, we got attacked at night time. And as we moved in that day, well, they say it was the same day, but I think it was the day after, 17th September, we saw the airborne invasion of Nijmegen, Arnhem and Eindhoven, and they all more or less virtually flew right over the top of us. That was quite a sight, I don't mind tell you. And then we got told what was happening, that they were taking these bridges. Now, on the way in there was very little attack fire because there were so many Spitfires and American fighters buzzing around these aircraft above and alongside them. But on the way out, as we saw, at least I saw, 6 Dakotas getting shot down. It was awful to watch. They had no chance, these people. They're only flying about 1,000 feet, and one after the other. So goodness knows how many aircraft, we wouldn't lose them going in, but we certainly lost them going out. So again, we were stuck there. Now the object of the exercise was for the 15th Scottish Division to go in there and hold a bridgehead as though we're trying to attack Antwerp. Now that was the broader picture, whether we needed a port to get our supplies in, because by this time the supplies were way back in Normandy, along with that thing called Pluto, pipeline under the ocean they called it, to bring more petrol across. All our ammunition and food supplies had to come up by road. So the Germans thought this was what the plan was, that although with the invasion of the airborne invasion, there was also an infantry attack on Antwerp. But it wasn't a case of that at all. It was to bring down the reinforcements from North Holland and Denmark down into Belgium to take the pressure off the airborne forces. And believe you me, we had quite a scrap there. It lasted for about, we were in there for 10 days. It must have been 3 weeks altogether. The division held that bridgehead. It was only 800 yards wide and 500 yards deep at its deepest. We're under constant fire, under constant observation. If you moved by day at all, you had to do a sprint. We even got, what's one for it, strafed by our own typhoons at one time. We'd fired smoke, which was red smoke, but by the time the aircraft got over the target, the smoke had drifted back over us. They came down and strafed us and caused quite a number of casualties. However, there was always somebody brave, and it was Ian McCall, a lieutenant, and a Sergeant Duffin ran out with our yellow smoke recognition grenades, waving at these aircraft to try and get them to stop, which they eventually did. But during the time we're in that bridgehead, even magnitude, with 4 people killed and goodness knows how many wounded, we're just acting as infantry. We weren't anti-tank gunners, we're just as infantry. And as I say once more, it wasn't a very, very nice place to be, and when the word came that we're pulling out that night, we were more than happy to pull out, believe you me. So we eventually made our way back again, and it was the next day we learned that the HLI had sent out the normal patrols, as we always did, only to find that the Germans had pulled out at the same time. So we felt it was such a waste of time, but we were assured by the powers that be, our divisional commander and the various other people who came to us after this action, to tell us how important that our action had been. Because even across the German radio, the crack 15 Scottish Division had crossed the Escaut Canal and were attempting to attack Antwerp, and that they were putting up very stubborn resistance. This was given out in the German radio, which we got in our little sort of regimental paper called the Tam O'Shanter, which was a newsletter sent out around all the battalions. So that kept us informed as to what was going on. So then it was a case of racing across Belgium. We took a couple of villages called Mechelen and Deans, stopped there for a little rest. And that night we again went out in patrols, and we ran into, of all things, a Belgian circus. So we made acquaintance with them, and we swapped our ration for theirs. It was the first time I'd tasted pickled herb. And they were very tasty, with German bread, or ersatz breads they gave us then. So the population was absolutely starving. It was the first time I'd seen this, and I think it's worth mentioning that every farm we took, there was not a cow, a goat, a sheep, or a hen to be seen. The Germans had raped these farms of every animal, took them back to Germany, and left the population absolutely starving. So we knew then that we're going to have problems feeding ourselves, never mind the population of Belgium and Holland. And as we moved up into Holland, it got worse. Now the next time we were on the move, we were told then that we're going to Eindhoven. And this is the time we linked up with American Airborne. And I think we were the first infantry they had seen. They'd been there for about a week or 10 days. And they were really too pleased to see us, and they gave us the news that that's what had happened again. They told us how bad things were up at Arnhem, that the airborne had been cut off up there, and there were all sorts of rumours, of course. And then we moved up to Son, which was one of the bridges you saw in the film Bridge Too Far, and we took that over from Americans and held that for about 3 or 4 days before they found another role for us. And then we moved up into Holland itself. The first place that we attacked was a village called Best, all things called B-E-S-T, and there with a Bata shoe factory, a big cement works, and a railway goods yard, which was very, very heavily defended. The country was flat. They seemed to have all the good positions. They didn't have any high ground at all. They were holding it. So we were overlooked every time we moved at all. However, we eventually sort of gradually, day after day, it was just a grind until 6 times as we wore them down. Then we took a little village called Vluet, V-L-U-E-T, and what a battle we had for that. it was heathlands, and some of that heath was about head high. And as they moved out, the Germans would just wait until they could see where feet still open fire on it as a quick burst with a machine gun, and then they would run. Now, unfortunately, in that action, we lost 2 company commanders in rapid succession. Major Robertson, who was my company commander at one time in A Company in the 1st Journey Battalion, and about an hour later, his second in command, Captain Shaw, I believe he was a Canadian officer attached to us, he got killed as well. So we were suffering casualties, what we thought unnecessary, but this had to be cleared. And it was then, day after day, this went on. Patrols at night time, making contact with the Germans, find out where they were, sorting them out the next morning.
In Campbell Real Fall?
Yes. Now then, as I say, this went on day after day. Small attacks, just in small pockets here and there. We're still suffering more casualties as well. And then there was one particular incident where they pulled us back before we sent us back in again. They told us we're going to get a strafing by the typhoon. So we're all agog watching this. We're all lined up on a road ready to follow up. When these typhoons come in from behind us, we could watch them. And then we heard what we thought was bells ringing. But it wasn't until we were virtually on top of us realised what we were hearing. It was a shell casing from 20mm cannon dropping from 300 feet or so, hitting this road, hitting our vehicles, and they were showering us with these empty casings. So you never seen anybody move so quick to get under our vehicles in all their life to get some protection, because if you're hit with one of these, it would kill you from that height. It was the first time we experienced this, so we're always very wary in future when we're close support with these aircraft. However, it did work because we did take our objective the next morning. Then we pulled out again to prepare for the attack on Tilburg. Now, Tilburg was the first major city or town that we were ever likely to occupy. And we're told then that we were in support of the Dutch Princess Irene Brigade was moving up from France to take this first town. It was more or less an honour for them. But when they got up, the word got round that the town was being held by a battalion of Dutch SS in the German army. And there was some dispute over this, so it was agreed that the 15th Scottish Division should take Tilburg. So after a lot of to and fro, we got ourselves sorted out, and then they went. 44 Brigade again went in first. We did a sort of flanking movement and come in from the sort of northwest. Anyway, by that time the Germans had pulled out, and there was very little firing, thank goodness, because the town was packed solid with civilians. Now, we thought we'd had a tremendous welcome in Belgium, but even the Dutch surpassed this. And it went on for about 24 hours. The number of times they sung the Dutch national anthem was, well, no, I didn't count. You couldn't have counted it. However, we were told then we were going to stop here to rest for a fortnight, to recuperate, because we've been on the move, one way or the other, for 100 days. We'd been in action, or we'd been in support of the frontline troops. We'd been feeding on army biscuits and compo rations, although we're getting one hot meal a day most days, which is extremely well done by the quartermaster staff. A lot of the time we're just eating cheese and biscuits and tins of bully beef to keep ourselves going. So it was quite a relief when we were told that we were going to stay here in this town and we've been billeted by Dutch civilians. So we found a family who were very, very good to us. They gave us 2 rooms and they sort of crammed into 1 or 2, and we're all right for the night. However, the next morning all the NCOs were called for an O group, and when we got to our place of O group, we were told then that there'd been a big attack had gone in the American flank on the other side of the corridor, and that we were being raced across there to stem this attack. So there went our 14 days leave with exactly 24 hours. So it was a night move right across Holland to what we call the Plain Marshes. Now, it was pitch black all the way up there. And when we got up to where we're supposed to be, of course we had our advance parties up there guiding us in. All we found was one American tank and one American soldier. And we could hardly see him, he was a black man. And apparently he had fallen asleep or something while the rest of them had pulled out. However, we occupied what we thought was the American front line, and then we sent out our patrols to find out what was going on, and we soon found out all right. We come under fire from nearly every direction in the map. So we started putting in our attacks as well. However, as we moved forward, we're more or less confined to these tracks. And even the paper said it was mud and mines. You couldn't put a shovel into the ground. As soon as you started digging in a slit trench, for example, it just filled up with water. So what we had to do is use the ditches alongside the fields, and they were full of water. So I can tell you it was a most uncomfortable, I think it was lasted for about 10 days. And we gradually wore these Germans down and pushed them back, village by village, until such times as we cleared them from the west bank of the Maas and pushed them right across the river. However, our task wasn't finished there. We were then told that because of the state we were in, we weren't fit for frontline action, and we're now going to be put in a holding position for, that must have been October through November, December, January. So for virtually 3 months of that winter, we were 7 days, as we called it, in the front line. I beg your pardon, 10 days in the front line and 7 days out. And we changed with the HLI and the Gordons ourselves into a sector from Venlo up towards Goch. So we occupied all these villages in the front line from time to time. And although nothing much happened, it was a terribly uncomfortable period. It was the coldest winter reckoned in history in Holland, the winter of 44-45. So every night, or every other night rather, we had to take our turn and go up onto the banks of the river and lay there all night long in listening posts with a telephone at our side which buzzed during the night. You picked the phone up and blew into it twice and put the phone down again. That signalled to him that everyone was quiet and everyone was okay. So as I say once more, it was nice when you get back again to little villages called Panigan, and we kept coming back to the same house all the time. So we got to know the family quite well. But even then we had our instance. Even the first night we were there, on the way up, the husband of the house went up to his little plot of ground to get some vegetables and stood on a mine and get killed. So that wasn't very pleasant. And during the time we were up there, although we were in the front line, we heard the explosion, and I believe it was the King's Own Scottish Borders were loading ammunition onto the back of a 1500 with truck. And it was Piat ammunition, and somebody hadn't put the safety cap back on, and one of these bombs exploded and blew the whole truckload of ammunition up and killed a number of young children that had been watching these troops operating. So we kept getting these sad stories coming through all the time, people being killed so unnecessarily. So by the time January came, we were glad to get back out of that area, I don't mind telling you. And we then pulled back way down to a place, I think it was Roermond or Maastricht, and then we're given our role again. I beg your pardon, sorry, we're pulled back down to Tilburg, that's what it was, to be reinforced and rested. So we're back into amongst an area which we knew, although we were out in the field, we were just some slit trenches with head cover. And up came our reinforcements, new vehicles, all equipped with Bren gun cars, Canadian Brens, and they took the Carl Lloyd carriers off us, which were good enough vehicle, but they were flimsy, the sides on were just tin. So we're quite happy to get these Carl Lloyd carriers, 2 to each gun, 1 to carry ammunition, 1 to pull the gun and its stores and crew. So we started our training after that for the attack on at Nijmegen to clear up between the west bank of the Maas and the Rhine. So after a lot of rest and recuperation, as I say, we then moved up to Nijmegen and were billeted in a school. Well, this was done in the darkness, by the way. We weren't allowed to expose ourselves in daylight. There were quite a build-up here. And then on the briefing, we were rather surprised that they still had a number of troops left that they had. And we're told that the attack would start on such and such a date, that the 15th Scottish Division would spearhead the attack. Now, on this briefing, we're told we're coming under command of the Canadian Army, and there would be 2 Canadian divisions on our left and 2 British divisions on our right, which was the 43rd Division, and I believe it was the 53rd Welsh, supported by the 51st Division, the 11th Armoured Division, and all sorts of other armoured division as well. And how they were going to operate was like a football team. So they showed us on the map exactly what was going to happen, and we were given the honour, if you could call it that, of leading the actual attack. The HLI on the left, or our left rather, with their guiles up front as well. So our first objective was a place called Kranenburg, which was a railway junction just over the German border, and this is the first time we'd actually occupied German territory. And the attack went extremely well right up until that point, and it wasn't in until we started the second attack that we did were casualties. Now, on this attack as well, as I told you, there was 5 divisions all moving virtually at once. But I think I'm right in saying with the biggest artillery barrage of the war, there was 1,300 guns firing on this particular attack. And where the HLI and myself were going in first, it was like a scene from the 14-18 war where we never practiced it very much. But what we did do was rely on our forward observation officers from the artillery to keep control. And we're told exactly what's going to happen, that when to move and when not to move, and they finally shoot us right on to our objective. Now the second phase of the attack was quite good until 6 times the Germans started flooding the battlefield, and we finished up wading through water up to at least our waist level until we got onto the higher ground, which is our objective, and they've shot us right onto that. And although we had several casualties, most of it was from our own artillery falling short rather than from the aim artillery, and quite a few casualties with mines. But having got onto our objective and bang on time as well, we're virtually overlooking the battlefield. And from there on in, that attack went in most successfully, and everybody said this, without the 15th Scottish Division effort taking that initial hill, they'd been all, would have taken it, but the casualties would have been pretty heavy altogether. And from there on in, it was a case of the 51st get the credit for clearing the Reef Hall Forest. We cracked the Siegfried line, we turned left to take Cleve and Goch, 2 major German cities that had been very, very badly bombed 2 nights previously. So there were all sorts of activities here, and it's the first time we also put an attack in with what we call kangaroos. Now these was Canadian ram tanks with the guns taken out of them, and infantry put inside the tank as armoured personnel carriers. We went in along with infantry, we were 6-pounders hooked on the back, and we put in 2 of these attacks most successfully. We just a screen of fighting tanks round us with maybe 100 tanks in the centre, and we just poured into these German positions, leapt out the tanks, and the Germans just gave themselves up. I mean, they're just sheer mass, sheer weight of numbers just overpowered them. And we were highly delighted, of course. We took hundreds of prisoners and without any casualties. We then kept going down there, although we did start getting out on our feet again, and that's when they started to take more casualties again, down to a place called Udom, where we get badly shelled, badly mortared, and then a little place called Xanten, X-A-N-T-E-N, which again would appear in the story later on. And having said that, we then made contact with the Americans on our right, and as far as we're concerned, that was the battle of the clearing of the Maas, between the Maas and the Rhine anyway. So we're then pulled back out again, back down to Maastricht and Roermond, to start preparing for the crossing of the Rhine. Okay? Now then.
Any other incidents that happened to you at the Reichswald that you should explain?
Again, it was over so quickly. Again, all we can say is the praise for our artillery. I mean, I know it was General Montgomery's great weapon, artillery fire to subdue these German positions. All credit to him, because he never let us down. Yes, there was an incident, actually, I must say. Okay, we're talking about artillery again, and this came to mind. It was during one of these times when we whether we were in the wrong place at the wrong time or whether the artillery got their coordinates wrong, but twice we were shelled by our own artillery and inflicted quite a number of casualties on us. Particularly a very good friend of mine from the carrier platoon, Sargent Stevenson. He got hit very badly, and we loaded one of my carriers to take him away, and unfortunately he died in the hospital. But we had quite a few killed that day as well. And until such times as we got that artillery fire stopped, we had no idea who it was, but the air was blue with swear words from the commanding officer. And again, it seemed to come at the end of the attack. You know, the war was virtually finished, or that particular part of the war was virtually finished when this happened. And then, as I say, that's the only incident, but I must say, to see the way the army performed in that particular attack, to see 5 divisions moving all at once, you didn't see all of it, but you saw most of it and heard the radio reports, because by this time we had good contact and we knew exactly what was going on. Virtually every objective was taken on time with minimum casualties. Good heavens, it's 11:45. Changed this last day. So, on we go to the round crossing.
Please.
Now, I haven't did an exercise on the mass. We did one by daylight and one at night time, and we were introduced to a thing called a buffalo. Now, the buffalo was a track vehicle, rather tall. The tail fell down so you could load a carrier or a 1500 truck or a 6-pounder anti-tank gun, as it was, aboard that thing. And when they closed up the back of it, it sealed it in. Now, it could run on the road on tracks, or it convert to what's one for it? Waterborne. And you had about 12 inches of freeboard, that was all when it was loaded. But the tracks also acted as paddles. And this is what we were to cross the Rhine on. We also had these ducks, but we didn't see much of them, which could run on wheels on the road, run into the water, and then switched over onto propeller power. So the preparation for this was quite intense. Plenty of briefing, plenty of air photographs, plenty of sand models of what we had to do. But, as the old bard said, the best laid schemes of mice and men gang off agley. Come the time, we then moved up virtually to the banks of the Rhine, and for about 3 days these big smoke, for the want of a better word, they looked like 240-gallon drums standing on top of one another, producing masses and masses of smoke. So we're under smoke all day in woods, and we're coughing and spluttering. Sometimes we even had to put our gas masks on to try and get some relief from this. And as the build-up came, ammunition was getting stacked and bridging materials getting stacked, and we saw a convoy of low loaders coming up with barges on it. And lo and behold, there was sailors on top of these barges giving hand signals, semaphore, on the way up. But these were actually helping to build a bridge across the Rhine. So we knew this was going to happen. And they actually had a small tugboat on one of these low loaders as well to manoeuvre these barges into position. So it was quite an exciting time. So the build-up went like this. We then were told that we're going to cross at 1 o'clock or 1:30 in the morning. But the 51st Division on our left would go for a town called Wesel, and the Commando Brigade on our right would go for a town called Ries, which was on what we might call the German bank, the German side of the river, and that we would cross at 1:30 in the morning. Well, you can well imagine the Germans are well alerted by the time we crossed. So by the time we got into our buffalo, ran down the banks into the river, the artificial moonlight going, which is searchlight shining onto the cloud base and reflecting back down on the water. Well, all you could hear was people shouting, "Turn these so-and-so lights out," because we felt as though we're silhouetted on the river. If we could see, 100, 200, 300 yards upriver and downriver, so the Germans could see us sitting out in the middle there like ducks. So there was quite a bit of machine gun fire from the German side of the bank. And although we had .5 Brownings mounted on these buffalo, we were only too glad to get into the river and across the other side. Now, my vehicle, my Bren gun carrier, was to my right. I could see him up the river. And as we hit the bank, we could see him climbing all right. And as we hit the bank, we didn't make it the first time. So the reverse back down into the river, and the current being quite strong as it washes a wee bit downstream. So by the time he had hit the bank again, and we managed to get up this time, there were quite a few yards separated me from my carrier. And lo and behold, when he got off the water, it was absolutely pitch black. So to then go looking for my carrier, and my driver was, his name was Bud Fisher, came from Falkirk. His regimental number was 2990000, and as he called himself, he was the last of their guiles. Because our numbers were 297, 298, 299. So anyway, having found Bud, and we then had to sort of get bodies out of the way, all the infantry were lying down, and I said, look, there's a carrier coming through, out of the way. So we eventually linked up with my gun. I then had to go and find my company commander, Major Graham, C Company, reported to him that we were ready. Any orders? He said, no, just keep your eye on me. So it was the normal form, he just kept their eye, and we told him where we would be to his right and rear. And there was a big bund there, you know, with the flood dikes. And the engineers blew that, only they didn't tell us. And the next thing, we get showered with this earth off this bund, you know, and we said, thank you very much. There was quite a bit of firing going on, Spandaus, you know, close proximity. But it wasn't until the next day that we found out we'd ran right into a brigade of the Hermann Göring parachute division. Now, we had no idea that they were in the area, and they were tough troops, believe you me. They hadn't seen much of the war. They'd been held in reserve sort of style. And it's the first time I think they'd been in action for some considerable time. So therefore they put up a tremendous amount of resistance, and they created quite a number of casualties. In fact, we had 31 killed that morning in our battalion alone. So goodness knows what the rest of the division suffered. They must have been all much the same. So it was virtually close quarter fighting. We had tanks swam across with us, although I didn't see them at the time, but when daylight came we could see them stuck behind houses here and there. And as I say, it was a case of just taking one farmhouse at a time, advancing behind smoke screens. But there was one incident that morning when the company commander, you know, I was lying on top of the bund when the company commander waved us forward and he said, I'd like a 6-pounder over here, and told us where to go. We'd no sooner got ourselves into position, we got our camouflage net up, the next minute a shell landed about 10 yards in front of us, showered us with earth, shrapnel. The tree that we were hiding under was virtually shredded. The next thing the company commander was telling us to get the hell out of it again, so to hook up the gun and disappear back over this great big bund. And so this is how it went on all day long. Stop, start, move here, move there, until we finally cleared our area, and it took us some considerable time. Because of the situation, the battalion gets split in two, and there were all lakes, you could call them, or floodplains in between, which had been flooded, and it split the battalion up. So it was just a case of each company commander doing what he could do until such times as we reached the other side and got on with objectives. And by this time, of course, the commanding officers were on the spot with temper, you know, because of the hold up, this, that, the next thing. But eventually we got there, and then the next thing we heard that the 6th Airborne Division was coming over. Everyone had to stop firing at 10 o'clock. So at 10 o'clock, over came the Airborne again. Now, whether it was, we knew it was the 6th Airborne, and to our right we could see the Americans, and we were actually waving at the guys standing in the door. So the grandstand view of the 6th Airborne Division coming over the top of us, and we could actually see them leaving the aircraft about 5 miles ahead of us. And then sifting away, and of course with a tremendous amount of fighter aircraft all around them. And then we looked over the river, and we could see then the Navy in action with this tug pulling these big pontoons into position. And by, I think they started about 10 o'clock in the morning at the same time as Airborne. Well, I'm not sure when they started, but I think they had the bridge completed at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And we actually saw the Amherst coming across the river. It was a tremendous feat of engineering to watch that happening, because the river must have been about 400 metres wide at that area, and a very, very fast current. It must have been 4 or 5 knots. So again, the Battle of the Rhine wasn't quite over for us. At 4:30 in the afternoon we heard we'd made contact with the 6th Airborne, and later on that night we'd squeezed these Germans in between us, and although they were putting up quite a bit of resistance here and there, we had to be very careful what was happening because we're then running into our own troops. So having made contact, we then sorted it all out, stayed there the night in these woods, had a briefing to tell us what was happening, and then we crossed over with the airborne on our right, us to the left, and then started our advance across Germany. I think the first big city or big town we took was Osnabrück. Now, there we ran into an American armoured division, and they were looking for something to do, so we said, fine, support us. So we loaded our infantry aboard these tanks, and more or less shot our way through Osnabrück, although there was very little opposition, and most of the town was in fire anyway. I think it had been pretty heavily bombed. Having got through Osnabrück, the Americans said, right, we'll need to stop here, we've been recalled. So we're left on our foot again, so we kept going on foot as far as we could go. And then the next town we took was Minden. Now that is quite a name, Minden, in history. And the King's Own Scottish Borderers, who had actually been at the Battle of Minden way back years and years ago, actually stuck roses in their steel helmets as they marched through the town. So that was quite an event. So having taken Minden, we then moved up to the next big town, which was Celle, C-E-L-L-E. Now we overran an airfield there, and when they say an airfield, most of it was underground. They'd been very clever, the Germans. They built their hangars, and then they'd piled earth all over the top of it with trees on top of that, so it was perfectly camouflaged. And it wasn't until we got up there we started finding the Germans. First time we'd ever seen the German jets. We hadn't seen them in flight. Well, I beg your pardon, we did see them in flight. Christmas Day, when we were up on the Maas, the Germans put in a strong attack against Eindhoven airfield and virtually wrote off the 2nd Tactical Air Force with these jet fighter bombers of theirs. And of course we had no idea what it was. The ACAC had no idea what it was. They couldn't even keep up with them. They couldn't pivot their guns quick enough. Anyway, this is the first time we'd actually seen them close up on the ground, although we're to see them later on. However, when we got to Celle, we had quite a funny incident with people with different coloured torches waved us through the town, and it wasn't until we got up to them we found out it was German military police actually waving us through the town. They had no idea it was British troops. So we quickly put them in the bag, and virtually captured the garrison. They were coming out of their beds. They had no idea that British troops were so close. That's how bad their communications were. We thought ours was bad. So anyway, having got up to I think it was the Aller, the river that runs through Celle, we found a bridge intact, although it was a wooden bridge. So we reckoned this, I know our engineers were up there along with us. The engineers went across and said it would be safe to take one vehicle at a time. So you can imagine us in a Bren gun carrier with a 2500 weight gun behind us creeping across this bridge, and it was creaking and cracking and swaying. But eventually all the battalion transport got over it. Unfortunately, the first tank that tried to cross it, the whole damn thing collapsed into the river, and they dropped about 30 feet with quite a splash. So it meant then we had to sort of delay our move until such times as they got a bridge built to take the rest of the armoured division. However, we kept moving, and it wasn't until we got up to the next big town called Mulesen that we ran into opposition, and believe you me, it was opposition. We were then on to Lunenburg Heath, and there the Germans had an artillery, anti-tank artillery school, as well as an ACAC training area. And the 10th HLI, along with our M10s of our own regiment actually, the 93rd I think it was, anti-tank regiment, and a sprinkling of tanks ran into an ambush and got badly shot up by these German instructors and fanatical cadets that were manning these weapons. So what they did was they stopped there and then, and we come under attack then from or under fire from multi-barreled ACAC weapons, these 20mm things, and believe you me, they could put up quite a rate of fire. And it wasn't bad enough with machine guns firing at you, but when you had these things whistling through and crackling, there was very little cover, so we suffered quite a lot of casualties there. And then somebody had a brilliant idea. Apparently they captured a couple of Germans who were only too pleased to guide us. And we then took to paths through the forest and we encircled Yulsen. So we'd drive right through this German forest, pitch black across Lunenburg Heath. We had no idea what we were going to run into. We had a squadron of tanks in front of us, about maybe 12 of them. I was in the leading 6-pounder behind a rifle company. It was close up to the tanks. And we went screaming through this forest. It must have taken us about 8 hours at least, steady driving, until we come down the back of Yulsen in the daylight by that time. And of course, what happened was that the Germans said it was full of hospitals, but as it turned out, they'd painted nearly every building in the town with red crosses so it wouldn't be bombed. But as it turned out, we had quite a lot of prisoners in there, wounded prisoners, as well as prisoner of war camp. So we're only too pleased to release these guys, British and American. So quite a bit of celebration there and stories we exchanged. And then they said, right, our last leg up to the Elbe. So then got aboard with vehicles again. And we're leapfrogging all the time. Sometimes we're marching, sometimes we were on TCVs, as we called it, troop carrying vehicles. Most of the times I say we're on our flat feet. But the Germans kept mining the roads and blowing up bridges and there were hold-ups all the time. And then we'd get what we called the funnies up with the fascines, which was a great big sort of 8-foot roll of timber in front of the tank, which you drop out of a ditch and drive over it like a bridge. Or a bridge which was like a caliper. It would open up and drop across these big holes in the road or these ditches and drive over the top of it. We also had amongst them, we'd only ever seen them in action once, the bombards, which was a sort of